Welcome back. For several years now, Milwaukee has earned a reputation as one of the most segregated major cities in the country, with Wisconsin having the second highest black-white incarceration differential in the U.S. We invited author and UW-M Professor Emeritus Dr. Marc Levine to help us understand the factors that have led to these disparities and the city and state's sobering statistics. Protests that we've witnessed over the past year have called for changes to American policing and brought much needed attention to the systemic racism within our criminal justice system. Sadly, systemic racism is evident at every state of the system, from policing to decisions made by the prosecution, sentencing, correctional discipline, and even reentry. The racism inherent in mass incarceration affects children as well as an adult. The Prison Policy Initiative states that the system is especially punishing for people of color who are also marginalized along other lines such as gender and class. My next guest is Dr. Marc Levine. He's a professor emeritus of history, economic development, and urban studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's a co-founder and served as a longtime director of the Center for Economic Development. Dr. Levine is also the author of the report, The State of Black Milwaukee, which outlines devastating inequities, black and white, across Milwaukee and surrounding areas. How are you, Doctor?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And I think in just introducing you really gives everyone watching an idea of why it's important to get your insight on this very important subject. So if you would really give us an idea on where your research has led you when dealing with the inequities that come from systemic racism.
Well, I've looked at it across a wide variety of areas. I mean, I've looked at employment, poverty, social mobility, economic mobility, the incarceration issue, the criminal justice system, healthcare disparities. I mean, I looked at, in that report that you mentioned, The State of Black Milwaukee, of over 50 indicators of sort of where racial disparities existed or do exist in Milwaukee and how they've developed over the years. And it's truly a devastating picture, the degree to which those disparities and those inequalities have persisted over a generation now, and obviously before that as well, but over the last 50 years, and many of those measures have gotten significantly worse. So I think it's fair to say on a lot of those measures of racial inequality in Milwaukee that while in some we've had some progress, to be sure, in general, we're about in the same place as we were in the late 1960s or early 1970s. And that to me is a shocking finding, and it's a shocking indicator of the degree to which systemic inequality and structural inequality is pervasive in our community.
Yeah, and I find it very interesting how you have written many reports and you've done the research, you've authored books, and you've engaged in many conversations dealing with race and racial inequality. And I think that Milwaukee always raises eyebrows from people not only across the country, but across the globe. Talk about that.
It is quite startling, the degree to which on each one of these indicators we remain, one of the most segregated and the most unequal communities in the country. We look at, I looked at, as I said, 50 indicators, and on I think over 40 of them we rank in the bottom one or two, and in over 45 of them we're in the bottom, the bottom 10. So we're just across the board in bad shape and have been just not making the progress we need to. And I think one of the things that is encouraging to me, because so much of the data that I've looked at is so discouraging, but one of the things that is encouraging is that I do think there's been a community consciousness raising in the last few years. I mean, clearly crystallizing around the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the like, and the introduction in this community now of a racial equity lens on public policy issues that I think is absolutely essential. And we see it now in the way in which the community is planning to spend some of the federal money that will be coming in now from the pandemic relief funds, and the like, to invest those funds in ways that enhance racial equity. So on the one hand, we have this abysmal record. On the one hand, Milwaukee stands out in ways that are, I would say, different in a matter of degree from a lot of other communities. So it's not like Milwaukee is the only place that has systemic racism or structural inequality at this level. I mean, Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland. I mean, you go down the list of cities. We tend to be a little bit worse than most of them on most of those indicators. So I think, we have to understand that those problems have existed and still exist, but then take some encouragement in the fact that there seems to be a community-wide change in addressing some of those issues. So we have a long way to go, but I think that's, at least for the first time in many years, I can say that's an encouraging start.
Yeah, that is good to hear. And one thing that I've continued to hear since I moved to Milwaukee, and I've been here over 20 years now, is that Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in America, and it has the highest rate of African Americans behind bars in the country. So if you would kind of talk about that, hone in on the things that cause those things to stick when it comes to the city of Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin.
Right. Well, the mass incarceration issue is crucial, and we do have the unenviable distinction of being, if not, the most incarcerated city for African Americans in the country, among the top two or three. It kind of changes year by year, and the rate's astonishing. I mean, if you take, for example, a study that was done that showed sort of where Black men who were born in the late 1970s and early 1980s were in the early part of the 2010s. So when they hit their 30s, 16% of those men who were born in the late 70s and 80s in Milwaukee were actually in prison in 2010. And if we take the full number of men who have been incarcerated over those years, it's roughly about 1 in 3 African American males in Milwaukee who have been incarcerated or are either incarcerated now or have been incarcerated during their lifetime. And that's just an extraordinarily high figure.
Yes, and there are clearly some reasoning behind that, and
Absolutely.
there have been documentaries and even a movie done on the zip code 53206, and I know, just like there are some very successful people who have come out of that zip code, but it has had a spotlight on it as being one of the most incarcerated zip codes in America. So what are some of the reasons, when you look at the research that you've done, that so many individuals are finding themselves in this predicament?
Well, I think it's related to the fact that we have all of these incredibly deep economic disparities based on race in this community. Those kinds of disparities we found are pretty closely linked over time to the rise of criminal activity. And with the rise of criminal activity, you're obviously going to have a higher rate of incarceration. There's no doubt that particularly in the 60s and 70s, and even into the early 1980s, there was a significant increase of violence in segregated communities. African Americans were overwhelmingly the victims of that violence and were overwhelmingly as well the offenders. And so consequently, with the rise in violence, with the rise of a political culture which sought to address the issues of central cities more with punitive measures and incarceration rather than social policies to address the causes of those inner city problems, we had this incredible surge, particularly in the 1990s. That was when the real rise in mass incarceration occurred in Milwaukee. And when we adopted these very punitive policies, when judicial discretion became very clear and the racial biases in that became quite palpable in the 1990s, that's when you saw this surge of mass incarceration. And the devastating consequences of that, you alluded to it at the head of this discussion, are that it not only affects the individuals who have been incarcerated, it affects their life chances when they're released. Their employment prospects are particularly dim. Unemployment rates among the formerly incarcerated around 40 to 50%. So you've got the employment consequences for the individuals, but then you also have the consequences on their families with no income, with the stresses that occurred when they were incarcerated. You have children who are obviously affected by this, and so the generational consequences go on and on. And then you get into things like the sort of the school to prison pipeline that exists in Milwaukee, where high rates of high school dropouts leads to employment problems, leads to ultimately, in many cases, incarceration. So it's a vicious circle and a real panoply of serious issues that feed into one another, and we've got to really find ways and policies to break all of those cycles.
So I find it interesting when I hear some people describe the incarceration rates that we see across America, especially when it comes to minorities, to modern day slavery. What are your thoughts when you hear that?
Well, I think there's probably an element of that. I tend to shy away a little bit from that description of it because I find it maybe a little bit exaggerated. But on the other hand, there is no doubt that there are elements of social control in this. Certainly, in an earlier period, there's no question that in the period after slavery, the criminal justice system was overtly used as a way to reestablish the controls of slavery. I mean, that's been well documented by many historians. I think the issue is a little more complex today because while there clearly are individuals who are, let's call them political leaders, who are oriented around implementing policies that are, I think, in that sort of control vein, I would shy away from saying that they're trying to reinstitute slavery or that kind of control. I think it's more, in some ways, a response to public sentiment. Be tough on crime. This is where the crimes are occurring, and these are the individuals we're gonna lock up. And there's been a rise, for example, in the white incarceration rate since the 1970s. Not as significant as the black incarceration rate, and the racial disparities are off the charts in Milwaukee. But the point is, in general, we've become a much more carceral society in locking up folks since the early 1970s.
Wow, it's all very interesting, and you did mention the school to prison pipeline. So research from the Center for Economic Development shows that Milwaukee's black students are the most hyper segregated in the nation as well. I'd love to get your thoughts on how that plays a role in really how kids go about being educated and how that really affects their futures ultimately.
Right. I actually did that study at the Center for Economic Development, and the finding, I think, is again startling and disturbing. That our schools are as segregated today as they were in the late 1960s. Milwaukee has the highest rate of school segregation by race in the country, and I think the consequences of that are manifold. We know, for example, that research is really pretty clear on this, that the best way to close the white-black achievement gap that exists in schools is school desegregation. Numerous studies have shown that test scores go up when we have a metropolitan-wide school desegregation strategy. Cities like Raleigh, Louisville, provide us some pretty good evidence of that. Unfortunately, in Milwaukee, while we did have a desegregation order for the city in the 1970s and the 1980s, as many whites have moved to the suburbs, they're sort of out of the realm of that desegregation order, and consequently, we have kind of a reestablishment or a resegregation that's occurred. But I think the fact that we have such a segregated system, and that segregation in schooling is so connected to poor, generally to poor school system performance, means that we're failing, frankly, our minority youth in our schools, and we're not providing sufficient avenues for them to achieve the American dream. And that consequently then leads us back into this potential school to prison pipeline.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It has been a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Levine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
When we return, we'll talk with Milwaukee County Sheriff Ernell Lucas as he shares his perspective as a leader in law enforcement and perceived disparities in policing people of color. That's coming up next.